We're both sides. Shavuot Tov. We're about halfway through the Mishnah, which starts, as you know, on Daf Beis Amud Aleph and finishes on Daf Beis Amud Beis. And we're getting our feet slowly but surely, wet here in Masechet Yevamot. We have the 15 arayos, in which case let's say Shimon, who ultimately passes away, gets married to a woman who's an erva to her brother Reuven. And Shimon even has another wife who's not an erva to Reuven, other than the fact that she's Eishes Achiv. And now Shimon dies without children, falls for Yibum in front of his wife's two wives, would fall for Yibum in front of Reuven. But they are one of the 15 arayos. Not only that, but even the second wife of Shimon, who is not related, she's not an erva to Reuven, she's in the category of Tsaras erva. And you may recall that we mentioned last week that Tsaras erva is derived from a very complicated drasha called Litzrar, an extra pasuk Litzrar. Now, one of the things I want to touch on today with you, is Tosfos on the bottom of Beis Amud Aleph, Dibra Maskil Vachos Ishto. Now, let me give you a little bit of background. Again, I'm not assuming I don't assume you know anything, so you'll be moichel me if I say things that are so simple. But Achos Ishto, which is the case where Reuben and Shimon married two sisters, let's say Rachel and Leah. So Shimon, by marrying Leah, he's marrying Reuven's wife's sister, such that she's an erva of Achos Ishto. And if Shimon dies without children, and his wife Leah falls to Reuven for Yibum, there's no Yibum here, because in addition to being Eishes Achiv, she's also Achos Ishto, which is one of the 15 arayos on the list. Now, this category of Achos Ishto should call our attention. Why is that? It's unique. All the other arayos on the list are what I would call, just using this phrase, the olam vayat. There's no exception. There's no situation in which the erva relationship terminates. The only exception is Achos Ishto, which means that although Reuven married Rachel and Leah is Rachel's sister, he can't marry Leah, but he could marry Leah exactly after Rachel dies. Right? So Shimon was married to Rachel, and now Rachel's sister, after Rachel dies, is no longer an erva. It's the only erva that terminates. So that the question now is, does the normal mechanism of erva not falling for yibum apply even in the case of an erva that could be removed? It's like a lower level of an erva. And for the fact that the Mishnah includes Achos Ishto in the list, we derive the conclusion that a temporary erva that could down the line be removed is not considered an erva. Now there are two major time periods, so to speak, time T1 and time T2. What happens is that when Shimon dies, leaving no children, Reuven, at that moment in time, is married to Rachel. Rachel's alive and well. So that now, when Leah, Shimon's wife, falls for Yibum, at that moment of Nefilah, right, that's a key word, Nefilah Yibum, which means the moment of the death of the deceased brother who dies without children, at that moment, Leah, Shimon's wife, is Achos Ishto, because Rachel, Baruch Hashem, is alive and well. So that Shimon is in a situation where his wife's sister falls for Yibum. If, on the other hand, let's say Rachel, Reuven's wife, would die before Leah, in other words, before Shimon, That's what I meant to say. So that when Shimon died, at that point, Rachel is no longer in the world. So at that critical moment of Nefila L'Yibum, his wife, Leah, is not a Chos Ishto, because the Torah says that a Chos Ishto is only B'chayeha, only while his wife is alive. His wife is gone. He can now marry his wife's sister. So in such a case, there would be a Nefila for you. And therefore, Shimon's other wife is not a Tzaras Ereva, because there's no Ereva relationship of a Chos Ishto. But nevertheless, even in the case where Rachel's alive and well, there is something different about this Ereva. And this Ereva relationship is a, shall we call it a temporary, it's not an absolute Ereva relationship. Okay. Now, Tosas wants to know why this list of 15 arayos does not include a nida. Now, this is a strange kind of question that Tosas is raising. What happens is Shimon dies, and his wife is a nida at the moment that he dies. So that in addition to the erva of Eishes Achiv, meaning, let's give names here, right? So Ruvain is Shimon's brother. Shimon is married to, we'll call her Rivka. And when Shimon dies, Rivka is a nida. So in addition to the normal erva, which the Torah was matir for Yibum, and that's Eishes Achiv, we now have another erva on top, and that's a nida. Does the erva, the arayos of nida, undermine Yibum? I mean, that would be wild, because the chances that a woman is a nida at the time of the death of her husband, I don't know if it's 50-50, but it's a very serious percentage. I mean, that can really torpedo a lot of Yibum if you're going to. And nida is not listed in the Mishnah. Anything that's not listed in the Mishnah is not a poter of Yibum. Now, the first answer that we would give is the reason why nida doesn't undermine Yibum, it's because it's a temporary erva. As soon as she finishes with her nida, she goes to the mikveh, and there's no longer nida. But then we have a problem, because we said that the nature of the erva of achos ishto is also temporary. Again, no one's putting a gun to her head and murdering her, but in theory, at some point in time, that erva relationship will, or might at least, terminate. So that we shouldn't be nispoil, we shouldn't be impressed by the fact that the erva relationship might at some point terminate. It still is an erva, and it undermines yibum, and that we know from achos ishto. So let's take a look at Tosafos Kasha. He says the following. Ein lahakshos, right? Are we all on the same page? Mm-hmm. So last Tosafos on that page. Ein lahakshos the nida te aser liyavam. That a nida should completely undermine the mitzvah of yibum. Afal pisha mitahara, even though she can be mitahara herself, after she finishes whatever zayin, whatever it might be. And if you're looking for a precedent to such a thing, that even though the erva might be removed, nevertheless it undermines yibum. Kimoachos ishto she'ena misyabemes afilu mesa ishto achrechen. Again, he adds two words achrechen, meaning that even if his wife, that means Reuven the Yavam, is married to Rachel and she dies after the Nefila Yibum, nevertheless, the halach of erva applies. So that the erva applies because at the moment of the Nefila Yibum, she was achos ishto, and at that moment in time, Rachel was alive and well. The lo dami, and now we can put achos ishto in a very unique category vis-a-vis all the other 14 arayos. Lo dami dachos isha v'shar arayos omed al hayavam tfei mishar. Oh, I'm sorry. So now we have to take a deep breath before we read the words the lo dami. See, normally Tosa says v'yesh lahakshos, and then he says v'yesh loma or yesh latarit. Here he says ein lahakshos, so you can't identify the yesh latarit. What's the answer? But the answer starts with the words the lo dami. And now Tosfos is going to try to find a fundamental difference between Nida and all the other rayas on the list, including Achos Isha. And you can't say that Achos Isha is only a temporary and it's a removable erva. So we have to find a different distinction. Tosfos offers two distinctions. So let's see the first one. The Lodami, the Achos Isha B'Shar Rayas HaIser Omed Al Hayavam Fe Mishar B'nei Adam Aval Nida Lekule Alma Asira. In the case of the 15 arayos, including Achos Ishto, those arayos are specifically erva for the Yavam, for Reuven, the surviving brother. But Nida is different because Nida is not an Isur that zooms in. I don't know, I shouldn't use that word, but that's exclusive to the Yavam, but rather it's an Isur on anyone. No one in the world, even our own husband, is allowed to have a relationship with her while she's a Nida. So in some sense, what happens in the cases of the 15 arayos is that as a result of a marriage relationship or some sort of a biological relationship, an erva is created, but that erva is very specific and limited to the yavam. But in the case of Nida, the Isser is on everyone, not just on the yavam. So I was bothered by this Tosfos. Honestly, I thought Advarim Kal V'chomer. If an erva which is limited in its scope is enough to remove yibum or zikas yibum, as we said, then how much more so an erva which is universal, which is applicable to every single man on the face of the earth. Once she becomes the erva of Nida, she is an erva for everyone. Ella, what you could say it's only a temporary erva because the erva relationship is going to terminate when she terminates on Nidus, and she's Mataras Atzmo, but that factor doesn't seem to play a role on Tosfos's in his radar screen, because we already proved from Achos Ishto that the fact that this erva will or might at some point be removed, that's irrelevant. But what's relevant is whether or not this erva relationship is unique to the Yavam in some sense. Again, it's not unique to the Yavam. I mean, there are other people who fit into that category, but it certainly is not universal. It doesn't apply to everyone, whereas Nida applies to everyone. And here's what I came up with. There's something called an erva, and then there's something called an iser kares. True, it's forbidden relations, and it would generate a severe punishment of kares, and that certainly Nida fits the bill, but it's not erva. And I'll prove it to you. In Masechet Kiddushin, we're going to learn that if you're Makadish and erva, the Kiddushin is totally invalid. So a man gets up in front of two Eidim, and his sister is there, and he gives her a kesef Kiddushin. He says, "Areat makudeshesli." The Gemara says it's not valid. Why? Because arayos is antithetical to ishus. So you cannot create ishus in an erva situation. But if a man is Makadish and Nida, the Kiddushin are valid. Why? And again, you might ask the Kal V'chomer. I mean, the Nida is even a more severe erva than your sister, because the Nida is Asura L'Kuli Alma. No one's allowed to have relations with her. But the answer is, that's not an erva. That's an Isur of forbidden relations. That's an Isur Bia. It's Bias Isur. Like the Rambam wrote a whole treatise called Hilchas Isurei Bia. But if you open up Hilchas Isurei Bia, you have two different categories. You have a category called an erva, and then you have a category like a Nida, who's not an erva. And Haraya, if Nida was an erva, then the Kedusha would not be valid. So it's really interesting. Although Nida, on the one hand, has a chumrah that goes beyond all the other Harayas, that she's asur to Kuli Alma, to the whole world, but nevertheless, that's only an Isur Bia, it's not an erva. An erva relationship is a result of either an ancestral relationship, meaning biological, or as a result of Ishus. Nida has nothing to do with Ishus. There's no difference between the Isur need of a married woman and Isur need of a single woman. Not one iota of a difference. So it's not erva. Erva has to be generated in a very unique way, and the way that Tosfos measures erva is by the fact that it's not universal. If it's universal, then it's not a relationship. It's not a result of a relationship or a result of an Ishus. It's in the woman herself. There's something in the woman that, like for example, if you would talk about a shifra knaimis, no one's allowed to marry a shifra. That's not an erva. That's an Isur Bia. A mamzeres. No one's allowed to marry except for a mamzer. But that's not an erva relationship. That's an Isur Bia. So we have within the universe of Isurei Bia, we have literally two fundamentally different categories. One is going to be an Isur Bia, and the other is going to be an erva. And the erva relationship and status depends upon one of two conditions, either of these two conditions. Either it's a result of what we call she'er basar, which means kiruv in terms of biological relationship, or it's a result of ishus. Neither doesn't fit neither into this nor into that. So neither therefore falls into this category called isurei bia, but it's not an erva. And again, don't measure it by whether or not it can be removed, because we have an erva relationship that could be removed. If his wife dies, he can marry his wife's sister. Don't measure it by the fact that it's applicable to a wider scope of people, because on the contrary, neither is an Isur generated to the entire universe, and yet it's not considered an erva. Don't measure it by the Chumras Havera, the Onshim, because neither is in fact an Isur Kares, like all the other Arayos. And yet, it's not an erva. And right now we have two nafkamiyos, which I think are in a sense related to each other. They're two sides of one coin. And that is, with regard to an erva, there's no possibility of creating ishus. You can't create a marriage relationship with an erva. It's mufka. An erva is mufka from ishus. So makadish is an erva, it's not valid. Whether he gets his money back or not, I don't know. This is issues with engagements, today. If the engagement gets broken up, so some say, well, if he breaks up the engagement, forget it. He doesn't get his ring back. But if she breaks up the engagement, she has to return the ring. If a man is Makadosh and Erev, does he have rights to get his money back because the kedushin was not valid? And another nafkamina is whether or not there could be a nefila yibum. Now, Yibum is also a potential issue. So since this woman is an erva, at the time of the nefila, so that ishus, which is called zikas Yibum, that connects the Yevamot with the Yama, could not be generated because erva is antithetical to any sort of marriage relationship. But when you have isurei bia, it could be even a chiyuv kares. That doesn't prevent nefilas Yibum. Why? Because there could be a marriage relationship. That's what I think Tosfos has in mind. There's a machlokes in the Rishonim whether or not yichud with an erva is doraisa. And there are a whole bunch of very significant Rishonim who seem to assume that yichud, if you're locked alone in a room with an erva, that's a violation of the doraisa. And don't ask me where it says it in the Torah. The Gemara has a very complicated drasha from Parshas Basis at the end of Kedushin and also in Sanhedrin. But there are Rishonim who say it's doraisa. What about yichud with a nida? And it seems to me that even Lamanti Omar, even if I grant you that yichud with an erva is doraisa, but yichud with a nida is not doraisa. And the proof of the pudding is a husband and a wife. We never found an Isur Yichud. Imagine if, I was told that there's one country in Africa where they, as soon as a woman comes to nida, she has to move out of the house, So we don't have that in Judaism. A woman can stay and she can sleep again in a different bed, but in the same room as her husband. What happened to Yichud with an erva, which is doraisa according to some Rishonim? So if you hold that Yichud is only Rabbanon, so then there's a svar called Paskasal. He can overcome his temptation because she's going to go to the mikveh in another week or whatever it is. But if you hold it's Doraisa, we don't play around with svaras when it comes to Doraisa. But the answer is she's not an Erev. Neither is not an Erev. That would be another nafkamina to this discussion. Now Tosfos goes on, and we're up to the word v'afilu. Tosfos is now going to try to add that not only is the Isser of Nida going to be removed down the line when she's Metaheres, but afilu b'shas, or afilu b'mashma, I'm sorry, it should say afilu b'nidasa, right? Afilu b'nidasa, which I think means during Hanidus, mashma, b'psachim, sof perik elu dvarim, the bas yibumi. Now this is really way out. Imagine Shimon dies, his wife Rivka falls for Yibum, and she's in Nida. And Reuven went ahead and he was miyabim. Now Yibum means by definition a baisabiyah. So he's chayav kares, is he not? For having beer with a Nida. But the answer is he's a tzaddik, right? I'm being mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum. And we said that a Nida falls for Yibum. She's not listed in our Mishnah together with the 15. And the Gemara seems to sue him psachim, the bas yibum, which I think means bas yibum, that the yibum is chal, and that he's mekayim the mitzvah of yibum.
So they don't have to wait like 3 months, make sure she's not pregnant from their brother.
I see what you're saying. We need what's called havchana. Right. So maybe he violated these havchana, but that's only in D'Rabbanan. What I'm more seriously concerned about is that he violated Isa Nida. Rabbi Yochanan, Ishto Nida, Baal Chayav. So that means that if a man has a relationship with his wife who's a Nida, B'Shogeg, obviously, he didn't do it deliberately, then he has to bring a Karban Chatas because he violated Isa Kares. And Isa Kares, B'Shogeg, will violate a Karban Chatas. But Yevimto Nida, if he went ahead and he had a relationship with his Yevama, who's a Nida, he doesn't have to bring a Karban Chatas. Now, this reminds me of a sugya in Masechet Shabbos. Gemara talks about a Moel who circumcised the wrong baby. You remember this? There were 2 babies. And one of them was meant to be circumcised on Shabbos because it was the 8th day since his birth. And the other baby was meant to be circumcised, let's say, on Sunday. I mean, the various scenarios. And the Moel, in his confusion, he was Mal ben Shiva instead of ben Shmona. And that's a violation of the Isser of Chovel, which is a told of Netilas and Shalom. And the Gemara says he's part of a Mechatas. Why? Because he was involved in a mitzvah, what he thought was a mitzvah. So it says here, Yevimto Nida, according to Rabbi Yochanan, he went ahead and he was miyavim his Yevama, who was a Nida at that time, Otu. And the Gemara asks on Rabbi Yochanan, Parchale Maishna Yevimto, what's your logic to exempt a Baal Yevimto ben Nida from a Chiyuv Kares and a Chiyuv Karban Chatos in the case of Shogeg, which would apply to any husband who has a relationship with his wife who's in Nida? The answer must be because of the mitzvah. He is fulfilling the mitzvah of Yibum. So the Gemara there, I mean, Tosfos doesn't quote the whole sugya, but the Gemara, you see the word bechule in Tosfos, right? He doesn't fill in the missing blanks, but the Gemara there in Pesachim wants to say that when a man has a relationship with his wife, and mistakenly he doesn't realize she's a nida, and Rabbi Yochanan says that in that case he's chayav, means he has to bring a korban chatas. Where it says he's also involved in a mitzvah, And that's the mitzvah of Ona. And the Gemara says that that we should equate Baal Ishto Nida with the case of Baal Al Yevimto Nida. And in both cases, he's involved in a mitzvah. So the Gemara says that when Rabbi Yochanan says that he's chayav, it's a case of what's called samach levesta. If you remember the last few psukim that we read yesterday in Parshas Mitzorah, so the Torah says v'zartem es bnei Yisrael mitumasam, and Chazal say that that's a woman who's samach levesta. So in that 12-hour period, which is called an ona samach levesta, normally she would see dam at that point, on that calendar date. So for a half a day beforehand, he should be porish, he shouldn't have relations. And this fellow that Rabbi Yochanan is talking about went ahead and he violated the Isser of Samach Levesta, Prisha Samach Levesta, which is a mitzvah saseh doraisa to be porish. As a result, he forfeits the mitzvah of Ona. There's no mitzvah of Ona at that point in time, even though she's not yet a Nida, which obviously once she's a Nida, there's no mitzvah of Ona, but Samach Levesta is also like a Nida, because the Torah commands us to be porish. So therefore that undermines the mitzvah of what? Of Ona. And if there's no mitzvah of Ona, then he has to bring a korban chatas. But in the case of Yevimto, this is called Ta B'dvar Mitzvah. In other words, he did fulfill the mitzvah. Again, he did it in the very wrong way by violating Nisa Nida, but nevertheless, he is what we call Toa B'dvar Mitzvah, mitzvah, and therefore he's part. But anyway, the very fact that the Gemara assumes that he's Mekayim the mitzvah means there must be Yibum. And how could there be Yibum if she's a Nida? After all, she should be, included in this category of Arayas. And the answer is that we need an Ereva relationship. And this is not called an Ereva relationship. Mashma de Konile. Konile means that the issues of Yibum is Chal. Why? Because he was, I don't know which is the cause and which is the effect, but he was Mekayim in the midst of Yibum. And Memela, she is his wife. She's an Ashes Ish, even though he was Ba al Hanid. Now Tosa says V'od Nira. Now the V'od Nira, Tosa is suggesting another answer. Apparently, at this point, Tosis is, he's willing to throw out the previous answer and assume that Nida is an Isser error. He says, Od Nira L'chalik. In other words, there's a difference here between Nida and all the other Arayos. And that's based on the fact that Nida is a temporary Isser Erev. It's what we call Shah Achas. Yeah, but Tosas already proved from Achos Isha that even if it's a temporary Ereva, it still is enough of an Ereva to undermine what? Yibum. Oh, he says no. It's different in the case of Achos Isha. The Achos Isha, Afal Pisha Mesa Ishto Achrechen, even though his own wife, we called her Rachel, died subsequently, nevertheless, Shuv lo tizakek liyibum. In other words, Tosfos is raising a very sort of naive, simple question. This is a question that a kindergarten child should ask, just intuitively. Okay, fine. At the moment that Shimon died, Rachel, the wife of Reuven, was still alive and well. But later on, Rachel died. Now, at that point, Leah, Rachel's sister, is no longer Achos Ishto. He's allowed to marry her. So why doesn't the mitzvah of Yibum kick in now? I mean, Shimon died without any children. It's a Rachmanos. And the Torah wants Lahakim Shem Zer Liachav through this metaphysical process called Yibum. Okay, so we understand very well that Reuven could not be Miyabe Leah as long as his wife Rachel is alive. because that would be a violation of Achos Ishto. He can't be married to two sisters. But now, let's say a year later or whatever it was, a month later, a week later, Rachel died. Shimon is still dead without any children. Now the mitzvah of Yibum should resurrect itself from the dead, literally from the dead of the death of Rachel. So the Gemara says, "Afal pisha mesa ishto achrechen shuvlo tizakek liyibum." The zikas yibum, if it wasn't chal at the moment of the nefil yibum, it does not get resurrected from the dead. Why? Kevan shenifter asha achas. Since at one point in time, at the moment that Shimon died, there was a tour of Yibum, we say there'll never be Yibum with this woman. Since she was the Erev of Achos Ishto when Rachel was alive and Shimon died, she continues to be that Erev even after Rachel died. So I mean, now Reuven technically could have married her. So why is that? Tosfos quotes a Gemara later on in Masechet Yevamot. We haven't gotten to Daf Pei Zayin. Halavai, we should live that long. And it says, Mishum shenemar, so Pasuk in Mishlei, Drachela darchei Noach, ki de Omar b'perek b'yesh mutaros. That's the name of the perek. Okay, what's going on over there in Perek Yesh Mutaros? This is the classic question about Yibum. Shimon dies, and he leaves a wife and a child. Tragically, later on, the child dies. So the Gemara wants to know, is there Yibum now? Notice there was no Zikas Yibum at the time that Shimon died, but Shimon left a son or a daughter. But now that child died. So at this point, there should be a mitzvah of Yibum. If all things are equal, if she's not an Erev in any other sense, except that she was his brother's wife, now that's the mitzvah of Yibum. Lahalkim shein liachim. So the Gemara invokes the pasuk Drachela darchei Noach. What does that pasuk have to do with our discussion? Because imagine, let's call her Rivka, right? Rivka has a child. She doesn't fall for Yibum to Reuven because Shimon, her husband, her late husband, left a child. What does she do at that point? Was she going to wait around for the rest of her life until Chas v'Shalom her child dies? Ridiculous. She goes ahead and she gets married. And the Gadol Adar is Mesader Kiddush. No one has any blink about it. So she's married now, and then she falls for Yibum because her child never dies. So what's going to happen? Her husband's going to have to give her a get because she can't be married to two men at the same time. And now Reuven could be Makai in the midst of Yibum. Gemara says that's not Drachel Darchei Noach. That a woman is forced to a situation where she has to be divorced because never she lost a child. And Tosfos says that although the Gemara does not apply this principle to Achos Ishto explicitly, but it's the same rule. What is the rule here? The rule is that if a woman is potter from Yibum at the time that her husband dies, she always remains potter from Yibum. Even if situations subsequently change, and now it should, we should revive the chiyuv of Yibum, we don't do so. Because otherwise a woman can never get married because maybe. The answer is if at the time that her husband died there was no Yibum, then she can get married. And even if the situation changes, we're not going to undermine and force her to get out of this marriage because now Yibum. There's no such thing. Yibum depends upon that moment that the husband died. If there was no Yibum, then Li'olam Vod there's no Yibum. The Gemara explicitly applies this to the case where Shimon, the late brother, died and he left Zerah, and the Zerah died later on. Not Drachel Darchei. The same thing, says Tosfos, should apply in the case of Achos Ishto and his wife later on dies, meaning at the time that Shimon died and there was an appeal for Yibum, Reuven's wife Rachel was alive and well, so there was no nefila for evil. So what happens now to Leah, who was married to Shimon, lost her husband? Her sister Rachel was alive at the time of Shimon's death. Now she's gone. But in the meantime, we were matir her, meaning Leah, to get married. We weren't anticipating that Rachel would die. So at the moment of the Nefila, there was no Yibum. If there's no Yibum, then we apply the principle of Jochel Dachino. We're not going to tell her, oh, you went ahead and you got married, and now you have to get divorced. But again, Rabbi said, let me just emphasize one point. Jochel Dachino doesn't mean that she went ahead and she got married. It's irrelevant whether she went ahead and got married. The law wouldn't change. Jochel Dachino means that the halacha has to be built on principles that would protect Jochel Dachino if. So we have to take into consideration the theoretical possibility. Now, at this point in Tosfos, there's sort of a little bit of a digression. What do I mean by a digression? Tosfos is going to sort of ask an implicit question on his thesis and answer that question and reject that question. What I would like to do, with your permission, is to put this in brackets for a moment because I'm eager to get to the punchline of Tosfos. So we're going to fast forward to the words Avol Nida. Do you have those words? It's not the end of the Tosfos, but it's the end of this section of Tosfos. So we're skipping approximately 5 lines, even less. Avol Nida Darchei Noam Hi. Meaning what? She fell for Yibum when Shimon died. She meaning, we called her Leah. And Leah was a Nida, correct? So what are we going to say? We're going to say that right now, at this moment, at the moment of Shimon's death, Reuven is enjoined, he's prevented from being Miyabim because she's a Nida. Correct? So at that point, there was no possibility of Yibum. Now, a week later, she goes to the mikvah. Are we going to say that since at the time of the Nefila, when Shimon died, there was no possibility of Yibum because she was then a Nida, so now it's not Jochel Dachino, because if Reuven can't be Miyabim, then she says, I'm going to get married to someone else. And now you're going to come and bust up my marriage? Tosfos says that's ridiculous. Why? He says the following. Jochel Dachino means that you're telling a husband, or in a case of Yibum Yavam, to wait. Let's see what happens down the line. That's not Jochel Dachino, because that, in a sense, locks this woman in a jail. She can't get married because you're telling the Yavam, wait around. Wait around and let's see. Maybe your wife will die. Maybe your child, your brother's Zera will, all that kind of stuff where we're ki'ilu postponing Yibum, that's a violation of Jochel Dachino. Because by postponing Yibum, based on a contingency that something might happen, you are locking this woman, this Yivama, into a cell. And that undermines Jochel Dachino. But what happens in a situation where you're asking for a waiting period, which you would ask even in the context of a normal marriage? You would say to a husband, right now you can't consummate. Let's say, for example, a man marries a woman and she's a Nida, which is quite common. It doesn't always work out with the shots and this and all that stuff. So what happens? We're going to tell him he can't consummate the marriage until she goes to the mikvah. It's not a pleasant situation. He just took her under the chuppah, but that's what's going to happen. We're not creating a situation that is unique to Yibum. This is a situation that exists even within the framework of marriage. So there's no violation of Jocher Darchi Noam if we say to the Yavam, hold it. Delay your mitzvah of Yibum until she's mitara herself. So take her a week, it take her whatever it takes her. That's what we would do in a case of marriage. Now let's see if we can fit in the part that we skip. He says, Afilu heicha lo mitchi. Mitchi here is a reference to achos ishto. Mehai beisel legamri. Now, let's keep in mind that Reuven and Shimon married two sisters. Right? We said that Reuven married Rachel and Shimon married Leah. But there are other brothers. There's Levi as well. Now, Levi is not related to Leah, to Shimon's wife. Because Levi is not married, or if he is married, he's not married to a sister of Leah, as Reuven is. So as far as the bias is concerned, meaning if we take into consideration all the potential Yevamim, all the Miyabim, I should say, I guess all the brothers that have the same father, then there isn't a fila for Yibum. She could fall for Yibum, even though she cannot fall for Yibum to Reuven, but she can fall for Yibum to Levi, because she's not an erva to Levi. She needs Yibum Kagon Sheish Achim Acherim. So Acherim means it's Levi and Yehuda and Yisachar, right? There are other brothers. So she needs Yibum from one of those brothers. And she can't marry anyone. So now, Rabosai, look at this situation. Shimon dies leaving Leah, who is the sister of Reuven's wife, Rachel. Subsequently, Rachel dies. So we're going to say, you know what? There's no Yibum over here to Reuven. Why? Because Rachel Darchino. What do you mean Rachel Darchino? Levi is a third brother. So she needs Yibum. If not from Reuven, because at the time of Shimon's death, Reuven's wife, Rachel, is alive and well. But she definitely needs Yibum from Levi. So right now, she is in a state of limbo as far as getting married is concerned. She has to wait till Levi makes his move, so to speak. Either he's miyabim or he gives a chalitza, but she is now already boxed in. So in such a situation, if before Levi gets his act together and she's in that, hanging situation, then Rachel happens to die, never. Reuven should now be able to be miyabim Leah. Are you telling me, but at the moment of the Nefila for Yibum, Leah was achos ishto of Reuven because Rachel was alive? Okay, I understand you have a problem with Yocher Darchino, because now you're locking her in because maybe Rachel would die. But that we can't do. That undermines Yocher Darchino. But in a case where, in any event, she can't get married because there's another Yavam, another brother. Now, when Reuven loses his wife Rachel, why not say all systems go, the green light, and he should be Miyabim Leah? Very strong question. He says no. Asura lezeh, she cannot be Miyabim Reuven, be Misyabim Reuven, Shemesa Ishto Reuven, the one that lost his wife Rachel now, subsequently. And that's a Gemara in a different parak of Masechet Yevamot. The Omar b'Perek Daled Achim, Kol Yevama she'enani kori ba b'shas nefila Yevama yavoim leha Harei hi ke'eshes ach sheyesh lo banin v'asura. Now, Tosfos quotes a Gemara here, so this is a absolutely solid scholarship on Tosfos, but conceptually we're still in a real blotter here. We're in the mud. And Tosfos is saying that we have a principle formulated by the Gemara that if Einani Kori Law, B'shas the Fila, if she's not Yavama Yaval, so then there is no possibility of Yibum later. It's like she has children from him, meaning that Shimon left children alone. But what happened to Drachel Dachinoah? Where's the Drachel Dachinoah here? She's waiting for Levi. Levi didn't get his act together yet. So she fell for Yibum to Levi. What's the problem? So Tosfos says the Ein Zeh Dachinoah im yesh lo lizakek lozeh sheniftara heimen. This is a whole new pshat. We said Drachel Dachinoah means you are binding her and not allowing her to get married, because who's going to marry this girl if maybe that marriage will have to terminate and torpedo because somebody will die and then she'll fall for Yibum retroactively, so to speak. Who's in? But that's not applicable here. She definitely falls for Yibum to Levi. So where's the violation here of the sensitivity of Drachel Dachinoah? So Tosfos says, you know why it's Drachel Dachinoah? Because since the Torah says when Shimon dies that she can marry Levi, but only Levi, she cannot marry Reuven. So now the relationship between this woman Leah and Reuven is an erva relationship. There's no Yibum at this point. What happens later? And Rachel dies. Don't create a situation of Yibum when the Nefila, when the Misa of the brother ended up in undermining and torpedoing the mitzvah Yibum and setting up a marriage relationship between her, the Yavama, and another brother, and Levi. So now, all of a sudden, Rachel dies, and she had almost again, Levi didn't consummate the marriage, but he had a zikas Yibum to Leah. That's already a relationship. And now you're going to say, well, Reuven, who couldn't have a relationship with this woman yesterday while his sister was alive, now has a relationship with her. Tosfos says, Ein Zeh Dachinoah im yesh lo lihizakek lozeh shenkvar niftara mimenu. I think what he means by niftara means that there was an Easter Yibum at that time. So if at the moment of Yibum there was an Easter Yibum, and on the contrary, she could have Yibum with another man, in this case his other brother, we'll call him his younger kid brother, then that would be a violation of Drachel Dachinoah if all of a sudden, because of the tragedy of the loss of Leah, of Rachel, now Reuven is going to be Miyabim Leah. So the point is that once there was a tour of Yibum, at that moment of Nefila, meaning at the moment when the late brother died, then to create now Yibum subsequent to that, that's going to be a violation of Drachel Dachinoah.
What does Reuven have precedent? Why doesn't
he has what?
Precedent. You have to consider that relationship for the other brother.
What do you mean? Why does Levi get precedence? So what are you saying?
Levi doesn't. He's saying this whole thing is held up because of Reuven and the fact that he is married to a sister of his brother. So we only deal with that situation, and that's the reason why there's no Yibum. But immediately, Levi, it has a mitzvah of Yibum.
Correct. So what we're saying is that since Reuven was already sort of a rejection. There was a rejection of a relationship between Leah and Reuven because at that moment when Shimon died, Reuven is married to Leah's sister. So at that point, since the Yibum is undermined and there's no possibility of Zikas Yibum, on the contrary, Haz Zikas Yibum, if to anyone, is to be the Levi, but certainly not to Reuven, then it would be a violation of Darchei Noam if at some point later you're going to create a Zikas Yibum. Whenever there's no Zikas Yibum at the time of Shimon's death, that means that Reuven is sort of rejected. And when I say rejected, what I mean is that the relationship between Reuven, the potential Yavam, and Leah, the Yavama, is antithetical. It's mutually exclusive because at this point in time, when Shimon died, Leah, is the sister of Reuven's wife. At that moment, since it undermines the Yibum, then we cannot create a Zikas Yibum later. That would be a violation of Darchei Noam, and Tosfos formulates it because Yeshla Lizakek Lezeshek Far Niftara. If there was already a ptur, which indicates that there was no Yibum, and it could be, in other words, the Yibum has to be generated by the death of Shimon. If at that point in time, the death of Shimon cannot generate a Yibum, on the contrary, is a ptur Yibum, then what happens later, when, again, in this case, Reuven's wife, Rachel, dies, could not generate a Zikas Yibum. The moment that there was no Zikas Yibum between the Yavama and the Yavam, at the moment of Shimon's death, you cannot get a Zikas Yibum. And that's in the language of Tosfos Kvar Niftara Heimen. Avol Nida. Why don't we say the same thing? That there was a ptur of Yibum at the time of Shimon's death because Shimon's wife Leah is a Nida. No. It would still be Darchei Noam if we tell Reuven that right now there's a blockage here, a barrier, you cannot implement the mitzvah of Yibum, but there is a Zikas Yibum. She falls for Yibum, and you have to be miyabim. And as we said earlier, in a case of a marriage relationship, very often we'll tell the Baal, right now, you can't consummate your relationship. No intimacy because she's a Nida. Wait until she's Mitara herself. That's not a violation of that doesn't, how should I say, rub the Darchei Noam principle in the wrong way. It doesn't irritate, if we could use that term, Darchei Noam. V'gabi Katan l'kaman v'perek Beit Shammai. Okay, now here's the case. What happens if Levi, right, the surviving brother, or I don't even have to introduce Levi, let me call it Shimon. Well, Shimon's the one who died, so let's call it Reuven. Let's say Shimon and Reuven were separated in age. Two brothers separated in age, right? Like I have a sister who's 14 years older than me. And that's common. So now at the time that Shimon dies, Reuven is a katan. He's less than bar mitzvah. What do we say in that case? If Darchei Noam means that if there's no Yibum at the time of the death, then there won't be Yibum later when things change, then later when Reuven matures and he becomes a gadol, are we going to say that there's no Zikas Yibum because he couldn't be miyabim or he wasn't chayiv in the mitzvah Yibum when he was a katan? So Tosfos quotes a Gemara in Perek Beit Shammai, and the case in Perek Beit Shammai is a katan. And what happened was the katan went ahead and he was miyabim. That's the case. He was 9 years old. The Chazal say that once a boy reached the age of 9, he's capable of halachic beer. And he was miyabim. I mean, there's no mitzvah of yibum here. He's only 9. So the Gemara says that yigdulu zem zem, meaning that marriage relationship will continue. We're not going to upset that relationship. And they'll grow old together, so to speak. So the Gemara asks, I don't get it. How is that possible? Since he was a katan at the time of the Nefilah Leyivu, which means that he's not obligated. Not only that, he's not even capable of bringing a child into the world at that point. So he can't be making shem al zera achi. So then he went ahead and he married his brother's wife, Shalom b'makom mitzvah. Now, your brother's wife is an Ishtar of Ashes Achi. The only thing is the Torah allows Ashes Achi in the case of Yibum, but he's a katan. He doesn't have the possibility of the mitzvah of Yibum. So the Gemara there quotes Abaye and Rabbah. Tosfos here only quotes Rabbah. Abaye says that we derive from a pasuk in Chumash, he has especially Alfusa, that a katan, since he will become a bar hachi of lahakim shemi achid, therefore there's even while he's a katan. And Rabbah says that the reason why Yigdalu Zemzeh is the belav hachi, even without the answer of Abaye. Forget about the answer of Abaye. Bi ikamidi da hashta asurale ubasar hachi sharile. In other words, Rabbah is saying, I don't need your Yalfusa Abaye. Forget about your Yalfusa. We have a rule that if there's no possibility of Yibum at the time of the Nefilah, when Shimon dies, then there'll never be a possibility of Yibum. And we know that this katan eventually will be mature enough so that he is a Yavam. He's got the credentials of a Yavam, just that right now he's a katan. So therefore, the halach of Yigdalu Zemzeh, according to Rabbah, is logical. I don't need to derive it from psukim. Because Mika Midi the Hashta Surale, you're going to say that she is an erva to him because she was married to his brother, Ubasar Hachi Sharile, and then you're going to tell me that nothing changed, just that this katan became a gadol. So as a result, we're going to say that now he can't be miyabim? Well, certainly he could be miyabim. So Tosfos says, wait a minute. What about Yochel Dachinoah? We said that whenever she's p'tura from Yibum at the time of the Nefilah, then to say that she becomes, she falls for Yibum later on is already a violation of Yochel Dachinoah. With the exception of a Nida, where we said she just waits till she goes to the mikvah, which is true for any husband or wife. And for Tosfos Hasam Nami, there also, it's not a violation of Jochel Darchinom. It's mamish like the case of Nid. The Ein Zed Darchinom, it's not it doesn't upset Darchinom. Im Tzricha Lahamtin Ad Sheyagdil. So the fact that she's going to have to wait until he becomes a gadol, that's not a violation of Darchinom. That's just built into nature, so to speak. Now again, what Tosfos is saying is that if there's no Isur, it's just a matter of waiting for a while till she's royal to be or he's royal to be boel. So is that considered a violation of Darchinom? Mashim Amtenes Machachu Katan, the Eno royal to be Alishaper Darchinom. The Eno Machmas Isura. Vahavi Ki'ilu Holach Yavam Lemedina Sayam. No, we don't say that because right now he's not royal Abiyah, it wouldn't be Darchei Noam to say that she doesn't have a possibility of Yibum at the time that her husband died, and therefore later on when he becomes a gadol. No. Shapir, this is considered darchino. Like let's say, for example, Tosfos says if the Yavam went on a long trip to the other side of the world, well, we're going to say that since there was no possibility of Yibum at the time that Shimon died, therefore when Reuven comes back from his long trip, there won't be Yibum. That's ridiculous. The answer is that's not a problem of Darchinom. In certain situations, we have to wait. We have to wait till time passes. Like in the case of Nida, time passes, she's no longer Nida, she goes to the mikvah. Here also, the case of a katan, Tosfos says we have to wait till time passes. Right now, he's not royal Labiyah, therefore they cannot consummate the mitzvah of Yibum. But we'll just wait for a while, and that's not a violation of Darchinom. In the case where Reuven is married to Rachel, and now there's no Yibum because Reuven can't be Miyaven Leah, Rachel's sister. Now you're going to say, well, all right, it's not Darchinom. Let him just wait till his wife drops dead. That's a violation of Darchinom. But that's not just a matter of waiting for nature to take its course. Waiting for a person who's not a bar hachi bia to become a bar hachi bia, or she's not a bar hachi bia because she's a nida. We have to wait a few days. No. Here there's an erva called achos ishta. Therefore, it's not considered darchi. Okay, then this is where we'll stop for today. Maybe tomorrow we'll give a little bit of an overview of what we covered today, so we don't, because everything in Yevamot seems to build one on top of the other, so it's good to remember.
So essentially, she becomes double aguna. If
I'm going to turn this around. Yes. You see yourself here at all?
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Yeah. So if the not even the katan, the yavam is on the other side of the world,
Right.
so she has to wait.
Right. That's not considered
But
darchi.
if he doesn't come back, then
She's
double.
yeah. So that's an aguna. And there's a whole parak of Yevamot about that. That's a difficult situation. Well, if we get one witness who can testify that he died, that might be a reliable witness in a case like that. But you're right. I mean, if never ever can clarify, whether or not he's alive, then she can't get married. I mean, that's one of the tragedies of halacha also faces tragedy.
Now, how old does the brother have to
He has to be 13 in 1 year. So that's another tragedy. Let's say, she died, Shimon dies, leaves her brother Reuven, and he was just born yesterday. The day before Shimon died. She's going to have to wait a minimum of 13 years until she can have Yibum.
Before Shimon dies, that's another situation. They weren't alive.
Right. If Shimon died and then Levi was born, that's a whole different story. That's Achim Shalom Hayavol. Right. We'll get to that too. Okay, so wishing you a great day.
It's good to be back.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a